So Season 4 has just wrapped up, and by the time this video releases, we'll be into Season 5, which features more trial environments and a new and very cool prime asset, Lilia. Now, I purposely held off on doing a lore video covering all the lore from Season 3, as it wasn't a particularly long season and only amounted to 2 videos. That's why I'm lumping 3 and 4 into one video, so thanks for your patience. It's been a wild ride from the start, and we've gone on a very long journey since the days of early access, and even since the announcement of Trials back in 2019. JT Petty, the Outlast writer, has crafted an incredible narrative and world set in the backdrop of the Cold War and the CIA's mind control experimentation. Before we begin, I will not be doing a rundown of what happened in Seasons 1 and 2, but if you do want a comprehensive rundown of the lore from those seasons, then the links to those videos will be in the description. However, I will be providing context and referring back to things that had previously happened when relevant. We're going to jump in now, so please be aware that from this point on, there will be spoilers for the whole of the Outlast series. So let's begin. One of the first storylines from Season 3 was titled After the Escape, and naturally it shows the aftermath of everything that took place at the end of Season 2. It's reported to the board that Murkoff's rising star Clyde Perry has been killed in action. For those who don't know, Amelia Collier had gone missing from a trial, and Clyde Perry, the director of historical refinement, basically the guy who would plug any security leaks, was the guy tasked with tracking her down. Months and months of infighting took place at Signala, and this led to fingers being pointed at everyone, but particularly between Easterman and Moses Scarfiotti, the guy who designs the trial environments, who clearly hate one another and would love nothing more than the other to be gotten rid of. Anyway, whilst they were squabbling about security breaches, Amelia was busy. This culminated in a large escape attempt, where hundreds of reagents managed to escape the Signala facility out into the vast Arizonan desert. Clyde was killed, and not only was Amelia captured, but she was also strung up in the sleep room for all to see, something that senior Murkoff employee Alice Avianos was eager to see happen. Alice herself has for months been having a secret affair with Murkoff's CIA liaison Jameson Lawler, something that Easterman is fully aware of. An investigation is to be ordered into Clyde's death, and he will continue to hold his title until they're able to publicly release a suitable cause of death. I'd imagine that putting chasing down reagents in a CIA-backed torture trauma farm would raise a lot of questions. This, I guess, answers the question as to why his role was held until 1961 on his portrait in the Mount Massive Asylum. An urgent update is put out to all staff, stating that Amelia has been captured, and she's currently being interrogated and questioned in order to find out who her collaborators are. This makes me very nervous for one of the denizens in the sleep room, Noakes, since he was someone that helped her, as we saw in the motion comics. Back in the sleep room, reagents are terrified, and this is as Amelia has been strung up, and just as Avianos wanted, she is being made an example of. Easterman journals again, and he states that he allowed himself to get flustered. He's referring to his epic meltdown, which has been an escalating behaviour throughout Seasons 1 and 2. But he likens himself to an artist. He speaks about Clyde being his nasty little bloodhound, and he speaks about Amelia having been strung up in the sleep room. Amelia is of course still alive. Murkoff probably know that they can't just kill her straight away or she'll become a martyr. That's the last thing they want. At the end of Season 2, Easterman had his meltdown, and when speaking with Avianos, he started to become more coherent. One document I need to introduce here is this one from the Escape Fallout storyline. It showcases a reason why Easterman may be feeling this clarity. It's related to a company called Kress Chemical. Previously, we spoke about Dr. Kusamura, the former Unit 731 scientist, who wrote to Dr. Easterman on the 17th of April regarding Kress Chemical, saying that Kress were the ones that inspired the toxic shock trials. It seems that Easterman did in fact authorize the Kress request that Kusamura was talking about, and on the 23rd of April, the day before they caught Amelia, Easterman took one of the Kress concoctions. He reveals it's something called bufotenine, but it's Kress's own formula, and that it's distilled from the urine of schizophrenics. So bufotenine has a history of being used to induce trance states. It's usually derived from bufotoxins, which are found in the glands of different species of toads. It's been used medically in order to simulate psychotic disease states in psychiatric study, but of course in this case, as just mentioned, it was discovered in the urine of schizophrenics. Easterman calls it potent, and naturally he starts tripping balls. He discovers a newfound motivation to stop the bleeding and to find Amelia. Another document we're going to look at is from way back in March 1957, and it's a letter written by the late Clyde to Alice Avianos while Clyde was in Buffalo, New York. Remember, prior to his role in historical refinement, Clyde was Murkoff Collections, and he met and interviewed potential prime assets. Anyway, the document's contents are related to Kress Chemical. It mentions a sighting of something known as the Buffalo Minotaur. Bodies also started piling up around the 40s, and at the time Clyde wrote this letter, the police were busy excavating the Kress estate. However, as the Kress family are quite prominent, therefore influential, and Kress Chemical is a key driver of the local economy, the authorities are sweeping the whole thing away. Clyde mentions Kress's relationship to Murkoff, so I guess this gives us some backstory on Kress Chemical. Perhaps Murkoff are helping get rid of the problem the Kress family have. One storyline introduced in Season 3, titled New Covenants, made me the most excited. On the same day that Amelia had been captured, Easterman, Scarfiotti and Avianos are in a meeting and are discussing how to contain the breach. Scarfiotti asks how long Amelia can live up there, and Easterman says they'll find out, with Avianos saying that they are there for the science. Scarfiotti is slightly taken aback by the brutality of his colleagues, but nonetheless, Easterman says that he thinks she'll survive for a while, given how long she was able to survive inside the walls. Scarfiotti calls Amelia Sleep Room Jesus, something that Easterman hints will be Murkoff's very own method of discouraging the reagents from ever trying to escape again. Avianos says that the Murkoff board are asking about Perry, but Easterman says that he'll handle them. It's pretty much confirmed here that Perry has provided them with the perfect scapegoat for Amelia's little uprising, as his own lapses allowed her to escape in the first place. Scarfiotti mumbles something, but Easterman shifts focus onto their naughty little reagents. So according to a Murkoff memorandum, the route out has now been terminated, and that means no more escapees. Easterman has now shut down all the reagent release and exit trial programs. No one's getting out until they are better. He wants the reagents to become addicted to the therapy, so much so that they won't want to release, that they will never want to leave him at all. He aims to do this by giving them more control of their therapy. But back to the meeting. Scarfiotti says that giving the reagents choice over their trial designs will allow them to get lazy and cut corners. Eastman pushes back, saying that he's merely giving them the rope to hang themselves along with one another. Avianos brings focus back to the reagents and says that they need to find the escaped ones, as hundreds managed to get out. Then Eastman pulls out the records on reagent 1616. Sullivan, Papa, North. Eastman goes on to state that North isn't very far from Signala. He's in Albuquerque as a matter of fact, and Easterman states that he's very susceptible to activation. Also that old Papa Noth is shockingly charismatic, and as a result, he's already built up quite the following. Easterman states that Murkoff can put this to better use and encourage a sense of mission in him, to make him a shepherd for all Murkoff's lost little sheep. Those of you that have been on this lore journey since Season 1 will remember that Clyde Perry followed Noth after his release from Signala and witnessed him claiming he was a human compass whose headings converged to within 40 miles of Signala. But let me take you back to Outlast 2. Alright, so we know from Outlast 2 that Sullivan Noth was a shoe salesman for a bit, until he got a bit gropey with a female customer. With debts, about to lose his home, and with his life going nowhere, Noth listened to a preacher on the radio, but he disagreed with the parts of the message regarding fornication. Then, turning on a radio, Noth claimed to have heard a message hidden in the static, from God to him, which stated that he needed a brave new prophet to carry his message. He would preach on the streets. Now, it's probably at this point that Easterman and Murkoff enacted their activation of Noth, as he'd already gotten his glut of followers at this point. His followers then occupied a ranch owned by a wealthy woman named Lydia Deegan, at which point he wrote his gospel, the Gospel of Noth, and he encouraged the women of his cult to breed regularly, with him getting involved himself. This was until his cult fled from the ranch after police turned up to raid it due to safety concerns. They fled into the desert, but his church had lost everything. He took inspiration from Moses and Abraham and climbed a mountain, slitting open his eyeball, had a vision of his church, which was a town deep in the desert. After driving off the tribes that were living on the land, the Testament of the New Ezekiel was then established in 1971 in the town of Temple Gate, and as we know, the events of Outlast 2 then took place in 2013. But the length of time Noth and his followers were in the wilderness is unknown. This likely leads to Murkoff using the towers outside the facility to keep Noth and his followers under control. The fact that reagents that escaped could be kept under the charismatic sway of Noth and then joining his cult at Temple Gate is an exciting development. It'll be interesting to see how this storyline develops further. But let's go back to Signala and discuss Henrietta, because as mentioned, Murkoff had some special plans for her. Again, for those of you unaware who Henrietta Grubbs is, she's a former reagent who formed a romantic relationship with Doris Ritter, another of the Sleep Room's denizens. Doris is someone who doesn't take part in the trials anymore thanks to a deal she has with the guards there at Signala, which may or may not involve blackmail. It's not currently known what that arrangement is. Henrietta was badly injured in a trial and was turned into a heavy X-pop through painful limb lengthening therapy, but she didn't fall under the charismatic sway of the prime assets like the General X-pop do, and was maimed by Leland Coyle, being disposed of in the sewers where the reagents encountered her during the escape attempt. After Henrietta was captured, she was fitted with fixators, which were screwed into the bone. These gave some support but stopped her bones from growing even more, which of course was a side effect of hormone therapy that she was subjected to. Certain organs have grown bigger and these are visible. She also had a broadcast receiver installed in her headpiece, and through this she is assigned a target reagent in the trials and she will relentlessly pursue them. When she is in pursuit, you can hear someone on the other end giving her instructions to hunt down and to kill a target, and when she's got you, there's no escape. You can occasionally hear the word execute. It's certainly possible that this signal could at some point be hijacked and she could end up being used to attack the guards and staff instead. According to her lore, the Jaeger seems to be suffering from something researchers term the Signala paradox, that she is finding comfort in her hopelessness. Her fixation on a single target is shown as being similar brain activity to someone looking for a potential mate. She still cries out for her Doris, though. Maybe she is looking for her and thinking maybe one of the reagents will be her. Lastly, on the Jaeger, it seems that staff are to be corrected on calling her Miss Lonely Heart, I guess because the observing scientists need to retain scientific objectivity and therefore can't start to feel sorry for her. Alright, now in the Primetime 2.0 update, a new storyline popped up called the After Amelia storyline, and it occurs 4 days after she had been strung up. The first document in the set is Easterman writing in his journal again. Now remember, after Easterman had a meltdown after months and months of erratic behaviour whilst living on a diet of gin and amphetamines, he is in an almost creepy way surprisingly calm. He's talking about the sun, something he often likes to do, and is staying upbeat, preferring to see what comes from the chaos rather than worrying about the chaos that just happened. He earmarks a particular reagent, 0741. Reagent 0741 is someone we've seen mentioned before. He was mentioned in a document from the Season 1 from the 12th of April 1960 titled Lab Rat, in which 0741 was separated for interrogation, as not only was he the only one they had managed to identify from the trial in which Amelia escaped, but he was the one who initiated the trial. But now we get a name for 0741, and it's Theo Nordaker, who Easterman claims to be a pervert masochist, but someone who has no outside connection to Amelia. He claimed to remember nothing of Amelia's escape, but according to Easterman, Theo didn't appear to be lying. Easterman talks about the strands of web being there, connecting them all. This again links into the egregore, the collective mind. He then talks about needing to investigate the sleep room staff too. For context, an unnamed reagent, now dead, was found carving a series of words into a corpse which spelled out the word egregore, which is another word for a collective consciousness. He sees the positives, implying that they're on the verge of breakthrough. As he puts it, crisis is potential. So Easterman goes and speaks with Theo. He's asking him about the egregore, which Easterman defines as a collective complex of unconscious archetypes. Group thought with an emergent will. This is a notion that Amelia's followers were obsessed with. 0741 is asked what he knows, but he starts talking about his medicine, and then when pressed on it further, Theo starts crying and mumbling something that is inaudible. That's all we've got on Theo, but it's very interesting that we've now got another named reagent in the facility. But yes, where's Amelia gone? Well, a document states that on the 1st of June 1960, Amelia had been moved to urgent care. This was under the orders of Easterman, who clearly feels he's made his point in making an example of Amelia to the sleep room citizens. It's noted she was experiencing hypoxia and dehydration. Easterman had made it clear that her survival was high priority. Murkoff have plans for her, no doubt. After the death of Clyde Perry, Signala is undergoing restructuring. Avianos wrote to a man named Silas Knisley, and the more eagle-eyed of you Outlast 1 players will recognise the name. His portrait was another one hanging on the wall in Mount Massive right next to Clyde's, with his title being Human Resources and Corrections. Anyway, Avianos' correspondence to him shows that they produced a budget proposal for Mount Massive and Sinyala to work together, sourcing subjects for Lathe, the name of the trial program if you're new here. For those of you that are not new here will remember that Project Lathe is actually in its second phase, as Lathe version 1 got canned as too many people died. Those subjects for Lathe 1.0 were subjects from Mount Massive, and these subjects were deemed unsuitable candidates for the therapy because they were too unstable and too broken. Now, is sourcing subjects from Mount Massive one of Avianos' crafty plans to sabotage Easterman, since she knows how Lathe went before? Who knows? What's interesting is the note scribbled on the bottom of this correspondence. It mentions Clyde's death, and for Silas to note that any rumours he's heard about Sinyala are exaggerated. And he mentions that they need bodies. He also mentions Judas goats. Judas goat, according to a dictionary, refers to someone who betrays followers or dependents, in this case reagents, often unwittingly and as the tool of an enemy, in this case Murkoff. Seems they may be looking for someone who can infiltrate Amelia's followers group in order to find out what her end goal was. One thing to end this section on is we seem to be meeting many people from the portraits in Outlast 1. We've met Olivier Branchik in his early correspondence with Easterman. We've met Clyde Perry, and we've now been introduced to Silas Knisley. One of the other portraits on the wall is Father Thomas Wilter, who served as a priest there until 1966. Father Thomas Wilter is blind in one eye, and it looks like he's been through some stuff. Maybe he's a reagent himself. So we previously mentioned Moses Scarfiotti, the architect of the trial environments. Back in Season 2, he expressed his displeasure at the introduction of a shuttle switching system for its flaws in terms of security. I mean, he did have a point, since that was how Amelia had helped loads of reagents escape. But it seems that any security concerns are being swept aside in favour of scientific advancement, and in a conversation between Easterman, Avianos and Scarfiotti, they begin talking about how Amelia's followers are giving reagents hope by spraying "I'll be back" on the walls inside the environments. But how is she communicating with them? Through the egregore? Through the collective consciousness? Easterman worries that the therapy, since it leaves the reagents vulnerable to any charismatic influence, has led to the reagents building Amelia into an imaginary psychopomp, which refers to a being that guides to see souls to the afterlife, almost like a deity. He says that the reagents are hungry for leadership, for godheads. Easterman says they need more exposure to the Prime assets and suggests bringing back Prime Time once again, including Franco Barbie in there. Scarfiotti again is concerned about the trial environments. A few days later, another meeting takes place between the three, and they're discussing something that's going to happen with the trials, and Scarfiotti is freaking out again. Easterman reveals that he's bringing former Unit 731 scientist Jun Kusumura back to Sinyala after he was previously sent to Los Alamos after the Amelia chaos started getting out of hand. You'll remember that Kusumura wrote to Easterman about Kress Chemical and mentioned some sort of scientific possibility, but good old Easterman didn't respond as he was going through his meltdown. Anyway, on the 13th of May, MKUltra director Sidney Gottlieb wrote to Avianos and says that he's spoken with Kusumura and is intrigued by the chemical advancements inside Sinyala. He sees them as outside the purview of Lathe, but he sees something called the Kress process, being able to provide long-term conditioning. In the last Prime Time, reagents were tasked with breaking the televisions, and on these TVs was a first look at what then was the next Prime asset, which turned out to be Franco Barbie. Now we've got the same, and there are two different images shown: the Minotaur, a couple. If Easterman is trying to focus on creating a family archetype with Leland Coyle being the father, Gooseberry being the mother, Franco being the screaming baby, then these two new primes could represent the grandparents. But a bit more about them. I previously mentioned from a report from Clyde, back when he was a collections agent back in 1957, that he'd found something known as the Buffalo Minotaur, and that they, I guess, had racked up quite the body count. The Kress family owned a company, Kress Chemical, that, well, manufactured chemicals, and this was a company that had enjoyed a relationship with Murkoff for a long time. In the meeting with the terrible trio of Easterman, Avianos and Scarfiotti, they're discussing something being allowed inside the trial environments, and this obviously involves chemicals, as they're bringing Kusumura in. Avianos mentions one half of this prime duo, the woman, had learned Japanese just to speak with Kusumura about chemical science. In the pictures on the screens, it seems that she may be the brains and the big guy's the brawn, quite similar to the Nick and Led dynamic from Outlast 2. Avianos mentions something interesting at the end. We always said we could create politicians. Easterman corrects her to thought leaders, which is of course a term he used to describe charismatic leaders such as Ho Chi Minh, Chiang Kai-shek, and Adolf Hitler. In the new storyline titled Politics, Lawler and Avianos are in a meeting on the 27th of May 1960. Remember that previously Avianos, after being blackmailed by Easterman about her secret romance with Lawler, had told him they should cool things off a bit. She didn't explain to him what was happening at Sinyala in terms of mass escapees, but in their current meeting she does. Lawler talks politics and mentions a place called Sverdlovsk in the USSR. Sverdlovsk is the place where 26 days earlier, US pilot Gary Power's U-2 spy plane was shot down whilst in Soviet airspace. This was an incident that led to the cancellation of the Paris summit, which had been arranged in order to discuss the situation between East and West Germany, and also to discuss relief in tensions between the USSR and the US. Powers had been captured by the KGB and was interrogated. What came next was President Eisenhower refusing to apologize for the US's spy program, and by the time Lawler and Avianos' meeting took place, Eisenhower had already admitted full knowledge of both the program and that particular flight. Lawler mentions a kid called Jack Kennedy who has a rich dad. He is of course talking about JFK. He mentions Alan Welsh Dulles, the director of the CIA who got fired by JFK after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Castro's Cuba. This led to theories that the CIA were involved in the assassination of JFK in December 1963, but we're getting ahead of ourselves as that's still 3 in-game years away. Let's stay in 1960. Lawler says that Dulles had been acting erratic, with his brother John's death from colon cancer being a contributing factor. Avianos goes on to tell Lawler that they may be able to help, but that they have a vector on political will, and mentions Kress Chemical. We'll come back to this storyline very shortly. So the start of Season 4 saw the new Prime Asset drop, and with that came a brand new comic from JT Petty and the Black Frog, so let's look at that. Let's go back to conception. The patriarch of the Kress family, Anton, was expecting children, twins, with the woman who was assumed to be his wife. One day in 1899, he either poisoned her by spiking her tea, or it was a complete accident. But either way, later, the twins she gave birth to were conjoined and horribly deformed. With him now without a wife, as she seems to have died giving birth, Mr. Kress would drink. His company was dying too, and Kress Chemical's stock was plummeting. Even though they were only around 10 years of age, the Kress twins, Otto and Aurora, would study in order to try and save their father's company. Around age 20, they discovered their passion. Otto in politics, Aurora in chemistry. With Otto and Aurora pretty much running Kress Chemical now, with their father just drinking himself into a stupor, the company's stock was now soaring, and having built a new plant in Buffalo, New York, Kress Chemical began to supply the US Army. Otto and Aurora would become, let's just say, enamored with one another, and would begin an incestuous relationship. Their quite considerable wealth allowed them to partake in various vices, and they would start to rack up quite the body count in more ways than one. They were out of control, and they would use people as victims to try out various concoctions. Their father, at the end of his tether, and needing to do something about these monsters that he'd spawned through his own scientific curiosity, decided to do something to stop them. Injecting them with something whilst they were asleep, he attempted to saw them apart. Aurora then threw a vial of something at their father, drawing a purple liquid into the syringe. She injects Otto with it, and he springs back to life. They then proceed to mutilate their father and made him into an abomination, seeing just how long they could keep him alive, and they then disposed of him when he eventually died. Due to their shape, they would be the subject of a local myth, which we've mentioned was the Buffalo Minotaur. More publicly though, Kress Chemical were being lauded as brilliant scientists. Otto would flex his political talents, and candidates running for Congress would pay him in order to increase their chances of winning. And they would. Otto saw repeated victories. However, due to their appearance, they would have to remain in the shadows. But Otto and Aurora effectively ran New York State's politics for decades. But one day, their extracurricular murderous activities had caught up with them. The police arrest them for the murders, but this is kept hush-hush. Clyde Perry turns up. Through their numerous contracts with the US Army, the government, and the high-profile nature of the Kress Twins' achievements, their misdeeds were swept under the rug, and their crimes were publicly blamed on a groundskeeper at the Kress estate. Anyway, since the plant provided many jobs and money for the local economy, the authorities allowed Clyde to take them away to Sinyala for consideration to be prime assets. It seems that Dr. Kusamura is having the Kress Twins, or more specifically Aurora, make some concoctions in a lab that Murkoff had given them, although they were still confined, as they are still considered very dangerous. Kusamura shares with them some news, and that is about Clyde Perry's death. They dwell on the fact that he was cut in two, and recall what their father tried to do to them. He then shares more news, telling them that they'll find out soon. The news, of course, being that they are to become prime assets in the trials, but that's the comic. But now let's move on to some more new documents that showed up in trials. We'll get back to the Kress Twins later and how they're potentially going to be used by Murkoff, but let's look at what's happening with Amelia. Those of you that are new to the lore, I'd suggest watching my Season 2 video, but basically at the time Amelia Collier was planning her uprising against Murkoff, Clyde Perry had tried to flush her out by interrogating, torturing, and murdering her partner, a man named Damon Green who, in his vulnerability, had been lured to Signala. After she'd been captured, it wasn't clear what Murkoff's plans were for her, but they clearly planned to use her in some way. On the 18th of May, Moses Scarfiotti writes to the Murkoff board, and he states that a security review of the entire facility has been completed, and all breaches have now been sealed and hardened. It's clear that the blame for the breach has been placed upon Clyde Perry, whose death has provided a convenient way out for those with some degree of responsibility. He writes about Project Scavenger, which reveals an unused trial environment. Reagents have been thrown into this environment and were given no ESOP unit, forced to scavenge them from bodies. Observing reagents that were willing to explore an off-limits area that was obviously out of bounds, they determined that these reagents were likely accomplices of Amelia, and they were placed under increased scrutiny. But Easterman has been watching Amelia since she had been moved from the sleep room to the medical wing. He's noticed that Amelia is smiling in her sleep, but that this smile is more akin to finding a blessing than that of satisfaction or cunning. He seems angry that she looks at peace. He then suggests that she may be seeing things while sleeping. Easterman suggests they could test the depths of her catatonia. One particular person we saw who was found in a catatonic state after repeated trauma was of course Blake Langerman in the Murkoff account epilogue. Is there a connection here? Do we have a lucid dreamer in Amelia? Is she someone that Wernicke will take an interest in for his dream therapy? I guess we'll find out at some point. In the Project Diarchy update, we see that Avianos has received a response from Mr. Knisley to the letter she'd wrote to him about a collaboration. In it, Silas says that he has been curious about what's been going on there at Signala, and he mentions that Dr. Wernicke, after being there at Signala, had gone to Haiti at some point. Now, if you haven't heard of Francois Papadoc Duvalier, well, a short introduction. This man was the president of Haiti from 1957 all the way up until his death in 1971. In his childhood, Haiti was occupied by the US for almost 2 decades. Anyway, despite his hatred for the US, Duvalier went to study medicine in the US, and after his studies he returned to Haiti with a wealth of knowledge. This was good, as people living in rural areas of Haiti had begun to suffer from a horrible skin condition known as yaws, which is a bacterial infection that resulted in lesions on the body. Duvalier would make his way across Haiti and would administer aid in the form of antibiotics, and he was seen almost as a sort of miracle healer who was blessed with voodoo abilities. Fast forward to 1957 and Haiti was boiling over and into a potential civil war. Duvalier ran for the presidency and was elected, but Duvalier wasn't the president that the people of Haiti had hoped for. He purged the country's army, creating his own and calling it Volunteers for National Security. Needing money to fund this militia, Duvalier turned to none other than the US, as they viewed Papadoc Duvalier as an anti-communist, and with Castro stirring things up in the Caribbean, this lined up perfectly for both the US and Duvalier. Anyway, after he suffered a heart attack in 1959, Duvalier slipped into a coma, and after he woke up, he seemed different. He viewed himself as a figure from Haitian folklore known as Baron Samedi, who was essentially the Grim Reaper, and he started modelling his look on him. He then transformed the electoral system, making himself a dictator, killing Haitian democracy. But as for what Wernicke was doing there, well, I believe this lines up with Wernicke's interest in voodoo. Easterman himself has even mentioned that Wernicke's aura was like that of a shaman. Is it possible that he had a hand in what happened to Duvalier? Perhaps he was sent there to mess with Duvalier, hence when he woke up from his coma, he was apparently like a completely different person. Perhaps Haiti was a testing ground for what Murkoff could actually achieve. Of course, these are just theories, but this is another emerging storyline that is pretty darn intriguing. But back to Knisley's letter. He says that he could arrange a visit to Signala at some point, and he writes about a potential patient exchange too. He mentions a Dr. Newhouse and says that he sent an attached roster of candidates that we cannot see, and he mentions a woman that has some experience with Dr. Wernicke. Who could this be? We'll find out soon, but Dr. Newhouse is someone we've seen before. One female patient we saw in Outlast 1's Mount Massive documentation was Shirley Pierce. She was a patient at Mount Massive until 1964, and she spoke in her journal about this Dr. Newhouse, along with mentioning government men joining the staff. Also in Season 4's Diarchy update, we got more documents from the politics set. We just looked at one document from this set back from Season 3, and it detailed a conversation between Avianos and her lover, Murkoff's CIA liaison Jameson Lawler, in which they had a conversation about Kress Chemical. As you'll recall, they were addressing a vector on political will, and we're about to see what that'll look like. But before we look at what was said in their meeting, let's go back a whole week to a meeting between Easterman and Scarfiotti, who appear to have somewhat calmed the tensions between them, at least for now. Let's face it, they both dodged a bullet when it came to the Amelia fiasco. Scarfiotti, in preparation for the Kress Twins' arrival at Signala, had built a new trial environment, and this was a shopping mall. Easterman loves it. Scarfiotti says that it's perfect for a trial because it's a diorama of a downtown shopping experience. However, Scarfiotti is confused about how the shopping mall is connected to politics. Eastman mentions the televising of the upcoming presidential debates on CBS, so let's paint a picture of where the US was politically. Some hotshot US senator by the name of John Fitzgerald Kennedy was running for the presidency and was set to take part in a presidential debate against the US vice president at the time, Richard Nixon. The significance of this event was that it was to be the very first time the presidential debate was to be shown on television. Many disagreed with this though, as people thought that the idea of televising this event would change the political process and that more care and attention would be placed upon what one looked like on television as opposed to what they would say in order to win over the people. Just look at Kennedy and now look at Nixon. After the debate, according to various surveys, it was considered that those who watched the debate thought that Kennedy had performed better, whilst those who listened via the radio had considered Nixon to have performed better. This links into what Easterman says next. He says that television would turn politicians into products. Scarfiotti isn't really following, but Easterman calls the mall environment a cathedral to consumerism. The next few documents expand on this slightly. We learned in the previous update that Aurora Kress is a bit of a genius, in the fact that she'd learned Japanese just so she could converse with Kusamura. Aurora mentions someone to Dr. Kusamura and his ears prick up. She mentions a German scientist named Fritz Haber, who used to write to them. Born into a Jewish family in Breslau in Prussia, now Wrocław in Poland, Fritz Haber grew up to be very proficient in the field of chemistry. He would go on to invent the Haber-Bosch process alongside his assistant, and this resulted in the formation of ammonia. Ammonia would go on to be used in fertilizer. This resulted in much higher quantities of nitrogen-based fertilizers being available, and as a result, this transformed the worldwide agricultural sector, and the food base of half of the world's population still, to this day, uses the Haber-Bosch process. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1918, but that is not why Dr. Kusamura venerates Fritz Haber. Oh no, he admires him for a much darker reason. Haber got involved in chemical warfare during World War I. He would go on to help develop methods of dispersing chlorine gas in enemy trenches. He would also be brought on board to advise troops such as Pioneer Regiments 35 and 36, who were essentially gas warfare troops. It's thought that after its first use during the Second Battle of Ypres, the number of casualties was around 67,000. Despite this being a moral conundrum for him, Haber saw this as duty, famously quoted saying, "During peacetime a scientist belongs to the world, but during wartime he belongs to his country." He would repeatedly defend the use of gas warfare, saying that death is death, no matter how it's inflicted. The gas weapons were no more cruel than the flying pieces of iron. Even after the war, Haber would continue to work for Germany's now secret development of chemical weaponry, managing to produce the cyanide gas Zyklon A. He died in 1934, 1 year after being forced out of Germany on account of his Jewish heritage after Hitler rose to power. His work in developing Zyklon A had damaging effects even after his death, as Zyklon A was used as the basis for Zyklon B, which was the gas used in the gas chambers by Nazi Germany during World War II. Even to this day, Fritz Haber is considered to have been a war criminal. Now you are able to see why Kusamura thinks so highly of him. Kusamura calls him an artist and a builder of empires. Fritz used to write Aurora letters, and it seems from this that Kress Chemical helped supply some of the chemicals used for Fritz Haber's chemical warfare. She mentions that Fritz Haber was working on an alternate compound to something known as methylene dioxymethamphetamine, which is a mescaline-like compound, otherwise known in these times as MDMA. The conversation here turns to the National Socialist movement, something that Kusamura states was a movement based in drugs and fear. They talk about the drug taking amongst the Nazi leadership and the soldiers, which we discussed in a previous video, where the soldiers were given Pervitin in order to make them march for longer. They talk about Hitler, that despite him being an ugly, short drug addict, he managed to rise to power, which now links us into the Kress' downfall. Otto got inspired by Hitler, and despite his being an ugly little man, he achieved something significant. Otto would watch Hitler's rallies and would cry. If he could do it, then why not them? So they attempted to step out into the limelight and, well, it didn't really go down very well at all. And this led to them being caught for their murders, leading back up to this point. 10 days prior to Kusumura's conversation with the Kress Twins on the 15th of May 1960, he had a conversation with Avianos and they were talking about mescaline, and that Aurora Kress had managed to isolate the effects of a synthesized version of mescaline on the different receptors in the brain that produce serotonin. Kusumura likens the effect to the use of peyote by cult leaders, and Aurora has managed to separate the visual phenomenon from the altered sense of self and time. It's a non-psychedelic effect focused on the sense of self. We are now able to see why Kusumura is so desperate for Easterman to bring Kress on board with what they are doing at Signala. He calls this compound Kress Precursor, and essentially it's used in order to create long-term fissures or gaps in the self that can be filled with brainwashing. In other words, using this Kress Precursor, reagents are now way more susceptible to thought reform. There are notable side effects, such as vomiting after coming into contact with the stuff, but the damage is already done at this point. Avianos states that she's getting tired of hearing Kusumura's research from various people outside of Signala, such as MKUltra director Sidney Gottlieb, and she makes it clear that the information is to go directly to her, or else. 5 days after this, on the 20th of May 1960, Easterman and Avianos are talking about the Kress Twins, and they're talking about the Kress Precursor, and that the Kress Twins will deliver it in person in the trials. Easterman then talks about secondary political influence. With Otto's political gifting along with Aurora's chemical persuasion and the brainwashing possibilities involved, Murkoff have now stumbled across the potential for a massive cash influx from the CIA. They're potentially making future political leaders. So you may be wondering how the Kress has got away with everything so quietly. Well, let's go back to the conversation between Avianos and Lawler from the 27th of May. After discussing the vector on political will, Avianos mentions that Kress Chemical going down is in absolutely nobody's best interest, and mentions they are a major supply for the US military. She says that she reached out to Clyde Tolson, who is the associate director of the FBI at this time. He's the deputy of FBI director J. Edgar Hoover. Murkoff reached out and helped them cover up the mess in Buffalo. Their end of the deal was that they got to add Otto and Aurora to their stable or roster of primes. Avianos states that it was the Kress's ambition that was their ultimate downfall because, as mentioned earlier, they wanted the limelight. Lawler at first did not see the problem in that, until he was shown a picture of them. Now he gets it. Avianos asks Lawler a question about who the most successful politicians of the 20th century were. After a few unsuccessful guessing attempts, Avianos tells him Hitler. Lawler, after delivering a rather hilarious "here we go," I can just picture the eye roll. She also mentions Mao and Stalin. She says they were ugly men with magical beliefs, that they were losers, criminals and failures. But as politicians, they were unbeatable. They then talk about Kennedy, that his politics were far from continental fascism, while still hoping to win an election. But Avianos does not give a hoot about the politics. She's talking about Kennedy himself. Kennedy joined the US Naval Reserve in 1941 and commanded a torpedo patrol boat in the Pacific Theater. He survived the sinking of PT-109 after it was rammed by a Japanese destroyer, and he played a large part in rescuing his crewmates. During this incident, JFK had gotten a bad back injury, and it required treatment in hospital, with him being medically discharged from the Navy in 1945. Avianos mentions that Kennedy was taking barbiturates and amphetamines for the pain that his back injury was causing him. She mentions that this concoction of Demerol and methadone would cause one to embark on quite the terrific high. They say that if they can get a real believer and a real addict in the White House, then there's no limit to what they can achieve. She then floats the idea of a political program at Signala, and this is where Otto and Aurora, along with their chemical refinement and the potential of their precursor, come in. The definition of precursor is one that precedes and indicates the approach of another. I guess the precursor is the first step, and Easterman's suggestion and the brainwashing along with the trauma from the trials are the second steps. We've got to keep a close eye on how this develops. All this talk of a political program at Signala intrigues me. We previously saw that because of Amelia's revolt and many reagents escaping into the desert, Easterman was devastated and annoyed that the people he saw as his children, that he loved, respected, and who loved him back, would try to leave him. So he shut down Rebirth. For those who don't know, after enough trauma had been shoveled in, the brain was susceptible enough to brainwashing, and the brain would be conditioned to respond to the trigger words spider, eye, and lamb. The reagent would then become a sleeper agent. Anyway, Rebirth is back, and it's changed now that the Kress Twins are there at Signala, but Easterman is journaling again. Yep, it's time for more unhinged nonsense. Remember back in another update, Easterman started talking about the phallus of the sun and how the sun apparently had an appendage. Well, he's back to that again. He's talking about him having stared down the sun, that he looked into the face of God and said blink. He talks about his reward being the mirror, that he can look in the mirror again, that he has a new face, hairless, dead and reborn. He speaks about Emil Schweizer. Schweizer is the source of the whole sun has a penis thing. Essentially, he was in London working for a bank, but got fired unexpectedly. He tried to end himself with a gunshot to the head, but failed. The bullet's damage caused delusions and paranoia. He couldn't use one eye, and he claimed to have heard voices. Now, Carl Jung. Carl Jung worked at a hospital in Zurich's Bergolzi Hospital in his native Switzerland. Schweizer was there at the hospital, a man that Jung would refer to as Solar Phallus Man, on account of Schweizer's claims that the sun did in fact have a penis. Easterman looks at himself in this mirror and sees himself as a sun with a penis. He links it into Roman Mithraism, focused on the god Mithra, that the Romans who worshipped Mithra were driven underground. He talks about Jung's archetypes and that they are thriving there at Signala. He finishes this entry by saying that the mirror is sacred. It looks like it didn't take long for weird Easterman to return. Easterman journals once more and a bunch of strange letters are visible. He, after 3 hours of detoxing a Kress concoction he calls MIVIM, which stands for Mirror Image Visual Morphosia, he reveals that the scribblings were him writing with reversed vision. He had tried to write, "I'm attempting." Whilst under the influence of MIVIM, he had looked in the mirror and he realised that the image of his reflection was more true than his real body. He says that the real side of the mirror was the reflection, and the mirror's reflection was the true self. He talks about communal rebirth now being possible. Administering the MIVIM to reagents apparently distances their minds from their physical bodies. Easterman says that rebirth will now recommence. Under the influence of this chemical, the rebirth process now involves the reagents seeing the trial environments reversed, completely different to how they know them. They are required to obtain their new records and hear the words. After this, reagents get activated and now get to work in causing chaos all over the world. Some examples being that they caused a plane crash in Georgia, killing 2 Cuban nationals. Teamster Union boss disappeared. A knife attack at the Vatican in which 2 Catholics were killed whilst preparing documents for Pope John XXIII's Vatican Council, which I'd imagine some would oppose due to a potential watering down of the faith. A foreign minister apparently ending himself, potentially derailing talks between the French government and the Algerian National Front, who'd been fighting each other since 1954. A fire at a prison where US pilot Gary Francis Powers was being held. A Guatemalan ambassador being detained with vital evidence going missing. 3 singers dead in an apparent self-deletion pact in a Beverly Hills mansion after their tour had them due to perform in Poland and East Berlin. And a senator's pop star wife being found dead, forcing him to retire from the government. The senator was a vocal supporter of African American voting rights in the American South. One final exciting thing to finish on in this section is that in the Moses Scarfiotti letter to the board, he writes about a substructure of a trial environment that could potentially be a mirror of the location the Kresses carried out their crimes. Perhaps some sort of chemical plant. But who knows? Towards the back end of Season 4, we got a program called Deep Burn. We've had the gas in the trials through Toxic Shock, we've had the cold snap through Winter Kills, and now we have fire. Let's have a look at a conversation between Alice Avianos and Jameson Lawler. On the 29th of June 1960, they're talking about pyromaniacs. It seems that the therapy is producing a rather awkward side effect in that the reagents love fire. Lawler basically says here that the reagents are killing their targets. Fine, but it's what they do afterwards that is the problem. They just like to set fires, and Lawler says if they wanted fires, they'd use napalm. Avianos states that the US uses a lot of napalm in vast quantities. Lawler argues that they came to Murkoff for precise guidance when it comes to the reagents, and he's pretty worried that this could be traced back to the agency. Lawler calls them the good guys. Just over a week after this meeting, Easterman has clearly been informed about the reagents' love of fire, and that they need to do something about it, and he's not happy about it. So he does what Easterman always does when he's feeling hard done by, and he writes in his journal. He's mad about the fact that Murkoff and the CIA want to reduce the reagent's love of fire, and he points out that he's tired of the bureaucracy at Signala. He uses the word toska, which is a Russian word used to describe a profound type of anguish. He goes on to claim that he'd always thought he had a gift, but as he got older he realised that he was a gift that has now been given to a task. He says that he can teach his children, the reagents, to love fire less, but he will not apologise to the sun. This links into Easterman talking a lot about Carl Jung and the patient he'd met called Emil Schweizer, and the whole sun having a phallus thing. And this theory, in turn, contributed a lot to Carl Jung's idea of a collective consciousness. Anyway, Easterman goes on to talk about water. He speaks of it being both birth and death, and reveals that he used to drown mice. He talks about discovering himself in the bath, and then he defends the therapy, saying that it contains within it multitudes. Another week later, the board had authorized the program Deep Burn. In this program, reagents not only had to avoid fire, therefore seeing it as a threat, and I'd guess becoming scared of it, but they were also to use water-filled containers to put out fires in barrels which contained a body. A deterrent to drill into their subconscious that setting fires to things was something they're not supposed to do. But more about the water. It's likely urine, judging by the memo stating that the water is likely made up from human and animal sources and is non-drinkable. Therefore it's likely bio-waste, as it's been sealed tight to prevent any odour, and staff must have a decontamination shower along with a full course of antibiotics. Pretty rough stuff. Diving back into the diary of Dr. Easterman again on the 20th of June 1960, he's journaling about Amelia once more. He thinks that the reagents are dreaming about her, about escaping. He's very annoyed that his children are not trusting him, and that they're being willfully stupid. He says they cannot trust each other, but that they can only trust him. Almost 1 month after this, a memo was sent to the engineering department at Signala, and it speaks about the insertion gates that the X-Pops and Prime Assets use. It says that insertion gates will be modified in order to adapt to upcoming therapy modifications. The memo says that these modifications will introduce new dangers to reagent containment and safety. But are they risking another escape opportunity here? The note shows us that Moses Scarfiotti is required to sign off these changes before they are to be implemented into the trials. Another document in this trust set came in the final update of Season 4, the Invasion update. In the new document, another diary entry by Easterman, we see him writing about when his uncle gave him a Swiss Army knife for his 9th birthday. This uncle, thanks to this gift, became his favourite uncle. From that day on, he trusted Uncle Hans, implicitly. Easterman would see a knife as something you can kill with, and something you can die with. And of course, his uncle giving a 9-year-old a knife was completely irresponsible, so Easterman wants to do the same thing with his reagents, his children. He speaks about a knife being a perfect totem object, and then goes on another bizarre tangent talking about something called penisnide, one of Sigmund Freud's theories. Penisnide essentially translates as penis envy, and Freud thought it as something that women go through before reaching sexual maturity, that they, don't have one. Easterman talks about penis envy in men and calls the penis a life-destroying monument, claiming that every sentient being alive in the world wants to take vengeance on the world for the phallus that they were denied. Finally gets to the point and compares the phallus to the knife. He says that he needs to give the reagents knives and says that he cannot. This is clearly a play by Easterman in order to break down the trust between reagents and to get them to trust him instead. And finally, as we see in this update, changes were made to the insertion gates that presented a potential new issue when it came to security at Signala, but we are yet to see the knock-on effect of this program in giving reagents weapons. Quite a while ago now, way back in Season 1 actually, we got some documents leaked into the trials which referred to the X-Pop classification. One of the X-Pop archetypes were called imposters, and according to the file on them, they are also known as tricksters. The reason for their involvement in trials was central to the development of reagents, in that reagents must learn that nothing and no one is to be trusted, as imposters would mimic the reagents in the trial. That method of conditioning clearly did not have the desired effect, in large part due to Amelia's shenanigans. Easterman needs that control back, now that Amelia is out of the picture, for now at least, but anyway. On the 29th of June 1960, Alice Avellanos and Easterman are meeting, and Easterman asks Alice if she ever visits Amelia, to which she responds a resounding no. She states that she is looking forwards and not backwards, as this is science. Easterman says that she lingers, and Alice tells him to just let her die. We spoke a bit just now about how reagents have been making a fair bit of noise when carrying out their tasks and how they were setting fire to things. This is heat, pun intended, that the agency did not need. And as Avellanos says, the CIA are indeed annoyed. They want things to change and fast. Bear in mind that this meeting took place before the Deep Burn program was approved. Anyway, Avellanos says that Murkoff need to make a gesture to the CIA, and they want to get a budget for the operations that will take place in 1961, next year in the in-game timeline, and before the election. As we learned in the Project Diarchy update, in the game's timeline, the US is to have a presidential election soon, on the 8th of November 1960. Easterman suggests a program based around fire, and thus the Deep Burn trial program was established and approved by the Murkoff board as a deterrent in order to stop these reagents committing arson. Easterman, however, did recognise the problem went much deeper and suggests putting a knife in the hands of the reagents, and naturally Avellanos is opposed to the idea of arming the reagents inside the facility. Easterman gets started on the totemic flexibility of phallic ideation, and Avellanos takes that as a cue to leave. Around a week later, Easterman is speaking with Olivier Baranchik. He's a highly trusted member of Murkoff and the Assistant Director of Behavioural Medicine at Mount Massive Hospital, and he's also the man who approached and kind of forced Easterman to work at Sinyala for this program. Branchik is telling Easterman that the board have concerns. Not the first time Easterman has been confronted with this reality, and he offers to speak to the board himself. Branchik denies this request without directly telling him no. For context, the Murkoff board is a very secretive group, and we do not know who any of the board members actually are. Anyway, Branchik states that the board reviewed the proposal for Project Invasion, and the board's concerns come from some patient transfers from Mount Massive, which we'll get to next, along with the fact that Sinyala has only just recovered from the security collapse, with lots of reagents still at large, out there, somewhere. Easterman argues that they turned that situation into an opportunity for learning, which is why Branchik is now very confused as to why Easterman thinks that giving weapons to reagents is a good idea. He argues, as we heard from him before, that this is all about trust. A phallic totem, and of course, Branchik is perplexed. Avianos is also there in the meeting and tells Branchik that the agency have directly requested to train the reagents in the use of knives. But the request for this came from someone inside the agency called Bissell. Richard Bissell Jr., at this point in the timeline, is the CIA's deputy director for plans and was heavily involved in the plot to kill Fidel Castro and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Castro's Cuba. But again, that's a little bit in the future. Could it be possible that the agency is still training reagents up to assassinate Castro? We already know that attempts to do so previously had failed, as seen in the Cuba ending. Or has Avianos lied to Branchik about Bissell requesting this directly? I guess we'll find out at some point, but moving on. She refers to November, and she is of course talking about the aforementioned election. She also mentions the term in clover, which describes enjoying a period of ease and luxury. She's talking about how if the election goes the way they want it to, then they'll be reaping the added funding from the agency. Easterman starts speaking about how reagents will not be themselves, per se, that they'll be wearing masks, a framed persona who wields the knife. This way the reagents won't even be able to trust themselves and they'll only trust him. But when the reagents are released, they'll have Easterman inside them, forever. However, the reaction of Branchik is that he seems to distance himself from Easterman's comments, and instead asks Avianos if he can see the budgets. Towards the end of July on the 27th, Easterman is speaking with Scarfiotti. Scarfiotti is asking Easterman why these reagents, who have been working together to survive for months and years, in fact, would suddenly be willing to kill one another. He talks about the mask being a totem of ego death. They'll do it because they trust him. Scarfiotti asks a valid question, and asks what will happen if an armed reagent attempts to kill a prime asset or one of the X-Pops, to which he responds that they will give the reagent a mild correction. He tells him that these reagents have been killing each other from day one. The Snitch, Bootleg Jesus, the Union Boss, these were all reagents that have been repurposed for use in the trials, and Easterman is convinced that they'll kill for him. About 2 weeks later, a memo is sent out to security, requesting that additional security personnel are required in order to escort imposter reagents into and out of the insertion gates. When they are taken out of them, the reagents are to be induced into a twilight state by sedatives and hypnotic suggestion, therefore removing the need for violent handling, although there are no restrictions to this violence. Any masks, costumes, and weapons are to be removed from reagents immediately. In my opinion, this is just another security breach and an accident waiting to happen. Weapons will no doubt make their way into the sleep rooms. And finally, in regard to this program overlapping Project Geister, the nature of program invasion means that reagents may experience changes in emotional response to the Skinnerman. Any of this brainwave activity takes place, and it's to be marked for Dr. Easterman's special attention. So back to the Sinyala Mount Massive collaboration. Silas Knisley has visited Sinyala. On the 14th of June 1960, Mr. Knisley meets with Dr. Easterman. He presents a list of 5 patients that meet the metrics that Avianos had asked for. Mr. Knisley seems disappointed that Avianos is not there with them. Easterman doesn't even entertain this and says that prime assets are his only concern, as a therapy requires a precise balance. Knisley once again asks about Avianos' situation. Again though, Easterman quickly changes the subject, saying that Mr. Knisley reminds him of someone and mentions his eyes. He's done this before, with Dr. Wernicke, where he described an uncanny shamanism to his face, and that he had the feeling that his eyes were changing size. I guess Silas Knisley has this same charismatic aura. Anyway, Easterman points out a female Russian patient, a woman that Silas Knisley refers to as quite provocative, and Dr. Easterman notes that her story is noted as reported, which means it's likely not 100% accurate. This report is about the siege of Leningrad, which Easterman refers to as the business in the forest. So during World War II, Nazi Germany set up a military blockade around the city of Leningrad, which is now modern-day St. Petersburg. The blockade lasted for 872 days but was never actually captured, What was going on inside the city that was so bad that it resulted in around 1.5 million deaths? Well, the Germans had in mind to bomb the city instead of capturing it. This resulted in mass starvation during the winter of 1941. Rumour has it that starving citizens inside the blockade were so weak from hunger that they couldn't make it all the way to the aid stations and they resorted to cannibalism. I won't go into the finer details of the stories of cannibalism as it's very disturbing, but it was considered a rare occurrence despite the extremely desperate situation in Leningrad. I guess the implication here is this woman was in Leningrad at the time of the blockade. But back to the meeting between Easterman and Knisley. Knisley insinuates that when they try to talk to this woman, she keeps talking about some other material. The account of what happened in Leningrad was coming from someone they refer to as her victim. Easterman calls this person her investor. Knisley then responds that this person was mutilated by this woman. Rather hilariously, Silas asks Easterman gives him some space, and he seems to be standing uncomfortably close to him. Easterman wants to know about her tongue. Knisley then gets even more uncomfortable, and the two appear to have a light scuffle. After things have calmed down a bit, Easterman wouldn't let it go. He really wanted to know more about her tongue. Knisley mentions that she was examined, and she has an absent lingual frenulum. Easterman seems amazed by this, calling her a provocative specimen, but Knisley is, again, not really seeing what he's so amazed by, referring to it as something he wouldn't exactly call miraculous. Anyway, Easterman is intrigued enough to want her transferred to Signala, and Knisley hints at just how dangerous this patient is, revealing that transporting her safely will incur considerable cost. In the invasion update, we got one additional document in the Beloved set, and this one is a news clipping from 1959, previous year in-game, which describes the death of a Frenchman by the name of Jacques Tréguier. According to the article, Tréguier inherited a large sum of money and used this fortune to create a very profitable shipping empire since World War II ended. However, this notorious playboy had vanished from the public eye in recent years as he was, according to people close to him, exploring his spiritual side. Then Jacques turned up dead by his own hand, apparently, with reports of him having been mutilated almost beyond recognition. Given that Jacques was exploring his spiritual side and had a lot of money, Jacques is likely the acolyte and investor they were talking about. Interestingly, one of the newspapers we can get in the Communal Rebirth details the second of the Tréguiers turning up dead. Again, mutilated and being found in a Catholic church, sans legs, and this man, Arnaud, Jacques' son, was in line to inherit the Tréguier fortune. But that's it for the lore update from Season 3 and 4 of the Outlast Trials. If you enjoyed this lore update, then please leave a like and subscribe if you want to stay up to date on Outlast Trials lore. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on what the new Prime asset could be like, but for now take care and I'll see you in the next one.